Ask a Vietnam veteran what it felt like to be hunted, and most people expect the answer to involve enemy patrols, ambushes, or snipers hidden in the trees. Those threats were real, and they were deadly. But if you stay with the question long enough, if you let the conversation slow and the memories surface on their own, the answer often shifts in a direction people don't expect. They start talking about the jungle itself, not as scenery, not as terrain, but as something active, something watching, something that didn't retreat just because men carried rifles. For soldiers who served in Vietnam, the jungle was not a passive environment. It moved, it reacted, it adapted, and within it lived animals that were not frightened by human presence, animals that hunted by instinct and opportunity, animals that did not care about uniforms, rank, or intent. These were not monsters, and they were not myths. They were predators doing what predators have always done. If you're a veteran watching this, you already understand the feeling, the sense that you were never truly alone, even when no one else was visible. The awareness that eyes could be on you without sound, without warning. The understanding that in some places, humans were not at the top of the food chain. For everyone else, this is what needs to be understood. Vietnam placed American soldiers inside one of the most aggressive ecosystems on the planet, an environment where predators had evolved to hunt in dense vegetation, low visibility, and extreme humidity. An environment where patience mattered more than speed, and where remaining unseen was often the difference between eating and starving. Those same conditions shaped the war. Predators in Vietnam did not need to attack frequently to shape behavior. Their presence alone was enough. Soldiers learned quickly that certain sounds meant danger. Certain silences meant something was wrong. Movement at the edge of vision triggered instant tension. The jungle trained men whether they wanted it to or not. Large predators were rarely encountered directly, but that rarity increased their psychological weight. Tigers and leopards existed in Vietnam during the war, particularly in more remote jungle regions. Most soldiers never saw one clearly. Some never saw one at all, but they heard stories. They found tracks. They noticed how animals went quiet in certain areas. They felt the atmosphere change. Veterans later described moments when patrols slowed without orders, when men instinctively tightened spacing or raised weapons without being able to explain why. Something felt off. The jungle was too quiet. Birds had stopped calling. Insects went silent. These were not tactical signs taught in training manuals. They were cues learned the hard way. The jungle's predators did not announce themselves. They did not rush. They waited. Big cats were ambush hunters. They moved without sound, used cover instinctively, and struck only when the odds favored them. Soldiers understood this on a primal level. Even without confirmed attacks, the knowledge that something large and capable existed nearby changed how men moved. Patrols avoided certain game trails. Fire bases were cleared aggressively at the edges. Men kept tighter perimeters at night. What made these predators especially unsettling was that they did not behave like enemies. They did not probe defenses. They did not test reactions. They simply observed. And sometimes they followed. There are documented accounts of patrols being shadowed for hours by unseen animals. Tracks appearing behind units where none should have been. Local villagers warning soldiers not to sleep in certain clearings or near certain water sources. These warnings were not dramatic. They were practical, matter of fact. The jungle had rules, and predators enforced them. Crocodiles occupied a different space in the soldier's mind. They were not jungle hunters in the traditional sense, but they represented something equally threatening. Rivers and canals were unavoidable in Vietnam. Crossing them meant surrendering balance, visibility, and speed. Crocodiles did not need to attack often to dominate those spaces. The possibility alone was enough. Soldiers learned quickly not to linger in water, not to wash unnecessarily, not to assume shallow meant safe. At night, rivers became opaque voids. Movement beneath the surface could not be seen. only imagined. Veterans later said that once you entered the water, you felt exposed in a way that land never replicated. Snakes were far more commonly encountered, and their presence was constant. Many species in Vietnam were ambush predators, relying on camouflage and patience rather than pursuit. Soldiers brushed against them without realizing it, stepped near them, reached into areas where they lay coiled and motionless. What made snakes effective predators in the jungle was not aggression. It was restraint. They did not flee, they waited. That behavior translated directly into fear. Men learned to watch their hands as much as their feet. Every branch became suspect. Every patch of ground required attention. But predators were not limited to reptiles and mammals. Even smaller animals exhibited predatory behavior when conditions allowed. Packs of feral dogs, aggressive macaques, and wild boar all posed risks under the right circumstances. These animals were not hunted by soldiers. They were avoided. Encounters were unpredictable, and reactions varied. Macaques, in particular, adapted quickly to human presence. They learned where food was stored. They watched routines. They moved boldly through camps, sometimes stealing rations or gear. When confronted, they did not always retreat. Soldiers described them as fearless, intelligent, and unpredictable. Not dangerous in the traditional sense, but capable of escalating situations unexpectedly. Wild boar posed a different threat. Large, aggressive, and territorial, they moved through dense undergrowth with speed and force. An encounter with a boar in thick jungle could turn violent quickly, especially if the animal felt cornered. Soldiers learned to listen for movement patterns that did not match human footsteps. What unified all these predators was not the number of attacks, but the constant reminder they provided. In Vietnam, humans were not visitors welcomed by the environment. They were intruders, and predators treated them accordingly. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Soldiers were trained to dominate terrain, to secure areas, to establish control. The jungle resisted that control. Predators moved through cleared zones. They crossed perimeters. They ignored markers of ownership. At night, this tension intensified. Darkness leveled advantages. Human senses dulled. Animal senses did not. Veterans described feeling watched during night watches, even when nothing moved. The jungle pressed in. Sounds came from multiple directions. The imagination filled gaps left by limited visibility. Predators did not need to attack to win these encounters. They shaped behavior. They altered movement. They increased fatigue. They contributed to the constant state of alert that wore soldiers down over months and years. By the time many soldiers rotated home, they no longer thought of the jungle as a place. It was a presence, a living system that reacted to intrusion and punished complacency. Predators were part of that system, enforcing its rules without intent or malice. Vietnam taught soldiers something few environments ever could, that being armed did not make you dominant, that being trained did not make you immune, that sometimes survival meant accepting that you were not the apex presence in the space you occupied. And that realization stayed with many of them long after the war ended. Once soldiers accepted that the jungle itself was active, not passive, their understanding of danger began to change. The threat was no longer limited to what could be seen through rifle sights or detected by movement in the trees. It extended into the spaces between moments, into silence, into patterns that did not belong to people. Predators in Vietnam did not behave the way soldiers expected enemies to behave. They did not rush. They did not probe. They did not test reactions. They waited. And that patience was what made them effective. Big cats, though rarely encountered directly, occupied a disproportionate space in the minds of men operating in remote jungle areas. Tigers and leopards were ambush hunters by nature. They relied on concealment, timing, and overwhelming force delivered in a single moment. Even without confirmed attacks on used soldiers, The knowledge that such animals existed shaped how patrols moved. Veterans later described areas where the jungle felt different, game trails that seemed too well used, clearings where vegetation was pressed down in ways that did not match human movement, moments when animals stopped making noise altogether. These signs were not always recognized immediately, but they were remembered. Local villagers sometimes warned units away from specific areas. These warnings were not dramatic. They were practical. Do not sleep here. Do not linger there. The jungle had rules that predated the war, and predators enforced them. Soldiers learned to respect these signs, even when they could not explain them. Patrols adjusted routes. Units avoided certain riverbanks at night. Fire bases expanded cleared zones when possible, not just for visibility against human threats, but to reduce the sense of being enclosed. Crocodiles reinforced this awareness in waterways. Unlike land predators, crocodiles dominated spaces soldiers could not avoid. Rivers, canals, and flooded areas were unavoidable features of the war. Movement, supply, and patrols all depended on water. Crocodiles did not need to attack frequently to control those spaces. Their mere existence was enough. At night, rivers became something else entirely. Darkness erased depth perception. Reflections disappeared. Water became a void. Soldiers crossing at night felt exposed in a way that no amount of training could fully counter. The idea that something large and unseen could exist beneath the surface lingered with every step. Brown water Navy crews understood this intimately. Patrol boats moved through narrow channels, bordered by dense vegetation. The water beneath them was opaque. Falling overboard was not a joke or an inconvenience. It was a serious risk with unknown consequences. Sailors treated the water with a kind of quiet respect, leaning over the sides only when necessary, moving deliberately, even during routine actions. Snakes represented a different form of predation, one soldiers encountered far more often. Many of the venomous snakes in Vietnam relied on camouflage and stillness. They did not flee when approached. They did not warn. They waited for contact. This behavior created a constant low-level tension. Soldiers learned to watch their hands as much as their feet. Every branch, every root, every piece of equipment left on the ground became suspect. Reaching into dark spaces without looking became a calculated risk. What made snakes particularly effective predators was their ability to share space without being detected. A soldier could pass within inches of one and never know it was there. That knowledge stayed with veterans long after the war. Even years later, many described instinctively scanning ground and foliage, habits that never fully faded. Other predators operated differently. Wild boar moved with force and speed through dense undergrowth. They were territorial and aggressive when threatened. An encounter with a boar in thick jungle could turn dangerous quickly, especially if the animal felt cornered. Soldiers learned to recognize the heavy, irregular movement that did not match human patrols. Macaques presented a different challenge. Intelligent, curious, and unafraid of humans, they adapted rapidly to military presence. They learned routines. They watched camps. They stole food and equipment. When confronted, they did not always retreat. Soldiers described them as bold and unpredictable. Though macaques were not predators in the traditional sense, their behavior added to the sense that nothing in the jungle behaved passively. Animals watched. Animals learned. Animals exploited opportunity. This blurred the line between environment and threat. At night, these pressures intensified. Darkness removed visual certainty. Sounds became ambiguous. Movement at the edge of perception triggered instant reaction. Soldiers froze, listened, and waited. Often, nothing happened. But the cost of ignoring those instincts was too high. Predators did not need to attack to influence outcomes. They shaped movement patterns. They altered rest cycles. They increased fatigue. Soldiers slept lightly, waking at unfamiliar sounds. The jungle never fully went quiet, and that constant noise eroded the ability to relax. Over time, men developed informal rules. Avoid certain areas after dark. Do not sleep near water when possible. Clear vegetation aggressively. Keep lights low but ready. These adaptations were not written doctrine. They were learned through experience. The presence of predators also affected morale. Soldiers trained to control space found themselves sharing it unwillingly. No matter how well a position was secured, animals moved through it freely. Perimeters meant little to creatures that did not recognize them. This lack of control was unsettling. Veterans later said that one of the hardest parts of Vietnam was realizing that dominance was temporary and incomplete. The jungle reclaimed space quickly. Predators returned. Wildlife ignored human claims of ownership. Predators also reinforced the idea that danger could come without intent. Unlike human enemies, animals did not plan attacks. They reacted to opportunity. This randomness made encounters harder to process. There was no motive to understand, no strategy to counter. The jungle taught soldiers to respect uncertainty, to accept that not every threat could be identified or eliminated, to operate within an environment that resisted control rather than yielded to it. By the midpoint of their tours, many soldiers no longer distinguished sharply between wildlife threats and environmental threats. They were part of the same system. The jungle pressed in from all sides, using heat, humidity, terrain, and predators to wear men down. Survival required constant adjustment, constant awareness, constant restraint. Predators were not the central danger of the war, but they were always present, always reminding soldiers that Vietnam was not a place built for humans. The jungle did not care who you were. It did not respond to bravery or fear. Predators acted according to instinct, enforcing the environment's rules without malice or intention. And for soldiers living inside that system, the realization was clear. They were not just fighting an enemy. They were moving through a world that did not belong to them. By the later months of a tour in Vietnam, most soldiers no longer reacted to the jungle's predators with surprise. Fear, when it appeared, was quieter, more controlled, less visible. The jungle had already taught its lessons, and the men who survived learned to move within its rules rather than fight against them. Predators became part of the mental background of daily operations. Not an emergency, not a story to be told loudly, but a presence that shaped decisions in subtle ways. Patrols slowed in certain areas without explanation. Men avoided sitting with their backs to thick vegetation. Positions were chosen not only for tactical advantage, but for how enclosed they felt. This was adaptation, not panic. Veterans later said that the jungle trained them to notice things they could never fully describe. A shift in sound, a pattern of movement that didn't belong, a silence that felt wrong. These instincts were not taught in classrooms or manuals. They were learned by living inside an ecosystem that punished carelessness without warning. Predators reinforced this learning constantly. Even when unseen, they reminded soldiers that awareness mattered at every moment. A snake that never struck still demanded attention. A big cat that was never confirmed still influenced movement. A crocodile that was never seen still controlled the river. Over time, soldiers stopped separating wildlife threats from the environment itself. The jungle was the threat. Predators were simply one of the ways it expressed itself. Heat weakened the body. Humidity softened the skin. Terrain exhausted the legs. Predators exploited all of it. This constant pressure affected rest more than anything else. Sleep came lightly, in fragments. Men woke often, unsure why. A sound, a movement, a feeling that something had changed. Even in relatively secure areas, relaxation felt temporary. Night amplified everything. Darkness removed visual certainty. Predators owned the night in ways humans never could. Soldiers stood watch, knowing that their senses were limited, while animal senses were not. This imbalance lingered in the mind. Some veterans recalled moments of intense stillness, when nothing moved and nothing happened, yet tension remained high. These moments were often remembered more clearly than firefights. There was no release, no conclusion, just the knowledge that something could happen at any second. The unpredictability was what stayed. Unlike human enemies, predators did not follow patterns that could be studied or anticipated reliably. They did not react to fear. They did not respond to deterrence consistently. They simply acted when conditions favored them. That randomness made the jungle feel alive in a way few other environments ever did. As tours ended and soldiers prepared to rotate home, many did not realize how deeply these experiences had embedded themselves. The habits followed them quietly, scanning ground automatically, listening more than speaking, reacting to sudden movement without conscious thought. Back home, these habits sometimes surfaced unexpectedly. A rustle in tall grass, a shadow at the edge of vision, a sound at night that did not belong. Veterans often described moments when their bodies reacted before their minds caught up. For some, the memory of predators came back in dreams. Not traumatic attacks, but moments of being watched, followed, observed from just beyond visibility. The jungle returned not as a place, but as a feeling. Others noticed changes in how they related to nature. Forests felt different. Dense vegetation felt claustrophobic. Rivers carried a sense of unease. Even zoos triggered reactions in some veterans, not because of fear, but because of recognition. Predators were not entertainment. They were reminders. What made these memories difficult to explain was their subtlety. There were no medals for adapting to wildlife pressure, no official records for the nights spent listening, no language for the way the jungle taught restraint and caution. Yet among veterans, these experiences resonated immediately. A few words were enough, a shared understanding, a nod, a look that said, "You remember too." Predators became symbols of something larger. They represented the loss of dominance, the realization that technology and training did not guarantee control, that humans were guests in an environment that did not welcome them. Vietnam was not unique in having dangerous wildlife. What made it different was how completely the war embedded soldiers within that environment. There was no separation, no safe distance, no moment when the jungle switched off. Predators enforced that reality daily. They did not fight soldiers. They did not hate them. They did not care who they were. They simply existed, doing what they had always done. And that indifference was what made them ruthless. For many veterans, understanding this came slowly. It surfaced years later when trying to explain why Vietnam felt different from other wars, why it stayed with them in ways that were hard to articulate. The jungle was not a backdrop. It was a participant, and predators were among its most effective messengers. They reminded soldiers that control was temporary. That awareness had to be constant. That survival depended on humility as much as strength. When veterans speak about Vietnam now, decades later, these memories often surface quietly, not as stories of danger narrowly escaped, but as moments of understanding, of realizing that the war was not fought only against another army, but against an environment that did not recognize human intent. Predators taught that lesson without words. They waited, they watched, they endured, and long after the jungle was left behind, the lessons remained.